immediately establishing dominion over central squares and setting the stage for flexible development. Opens a pathway for the queen and bishop, embracing a flexible structure that often leads to rich middle-game battles. Securing central presence and developing a knight to its natural square, white readies for further pawn advances or piece deployment. Developing another knight establishes a solid central presence and prepares for castling, harmonizing with the earlier pawn advance. Preparing to fianchetto the kingside bishop, aiming for long-term queenside pressure and central control. Black immediately challenges the center, opening avenues and disrupting white's potential kingside expansion. Solidifying kingside development, this bishop prepares for fianchettoed pressure along the long diagonal, aiming to control central squares and support a potential queenside expansion. Black grabs the pawn, opening lines but inviting white's pieces into active positions. Snatching that pawn immediately forces a king shuffle, potentially disrupting black's development and creating targets. Safeguarding the queen while opening a diagonal for her bishop is a sensible retreat from the aggressive check, preserving material. Recapturing the pawn resolves the immediate material imbalance, but potentially offers black a chance to consolidate their piece development. Reclaiming the pawn via the queen maneuver now frees the king and sets up a more harmonious central presence. Stabilizing the queenside pawn structure and preparing for queenside development seems the intent. Trading queens simplifies the position, potentially favoring black's piece activity in the ensuing middle game skirmishes. Capturing the queen on c4 opens a clear path for the b-pawn, aiming to control central squares and potentially restrict black's development. Developing the knight here aims for kingside counterplay and potentially clearing the d-pawn's path. Developing the knight here frees up the c-pawn, enabling aggressive pawn play and aiming for central control. Developing the bishop to b4 pressures white's queenside pawn structure and challenges the c4 pawn, aiming for positional disruption. Seizing central space and forcing black's pieces into awkward positions, this aggressive thrust aims to exploit the vulnerable queenside. Steering the bishop to the rim might seem passive, but it creates a dynamic diagonal threat and eyes potential weaknesses. Re-establishing the bishop's activity after the queen trade, this aims to pressure the b-pawn and control key diagonals. Challenging the bishop's placement, this move forces a decision, potentially opening lines for your pieces. Strategically, this knight repositions to a more active diagonal, potentially pressuring black's pawn structure and seeking new attacking avenues. Reinforcing the bishop's strong diagonal occupation, this maneuver secures the piece while preparing for future pawn advances in the center. Controlling the d4 square, the knight now looks to reroute, potentially to c5 for increased pressure. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure, now seeks to undermine white's advanced knight and free the bishop. Central pawn thrust opens diagonals for your bishops and aims to seize crucial central space. Expanding on the queen side, this pawn thrust aims to gain breathing room and potentially disrupt white's knight positioning. Securing the monarch initiates a strategic repossession of central space, preparing for future pawn advances. This pawn thrust aggressively aims to dislodge the knight and gain crucial queenside space, but potentially weakens the light squares. Retreating the knight opens a pathway for the queen, but relinquishes central presence. Developing the bishop to d8 liberates the c7 pawn for further action and prepares the eventual recapture of the a4 pawn. This knight finds a more active post, eyeing central squares and preparing for a potential kingside pawn push. Shifting the bishop to attack the knight on c3, aiming to disrupt white's central control and perhaps exploit the doubled pawns later. Exchanging bishop simplifies, potentially opening lines for white's knights. Initiating the king to a more active central post, aiming to participate in the upcoming struggle while challenging white's pawn structure. Pushing the pawn forward creates immediate space, potentially trapping black's knight and defining the pawn structure's future role. Injecting a knight to the center, this move contests critical squares and prepares for further pawn advances. Securing the knight's advanced outpost on e5 creates a powerful central presence and restricts black's pawn breaks. A bold foray, this knight plunges into enemy territory, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially trap the pinned bishop. Gaining space on the queen side, with the bishop's repositioning solidifies white's central control. Provoking a pawn storm with this aggressive advance immediately challenges white's central control and opens lines for black's pieces. This knight now eyes the open c3 square, aiming to disrupt black's central pawn structure and potentially gain a tempo. Shifting the knight to b5 aims to exploit the weakened queen side, potentially forcing white into passive pawn structure. Solidifying central control and preparing kingside castling, this move anchors white's pawn structure. Shifting the king to d8 solidifies defense, while eyeing potential counterplay on the queen side. Securing the central files now, white aims to prevent black's pieces from coordinating effectively. This pawn's march, though ambitious, overextends its support structure and may invite positional weaknesses. Opening the bishop's diagonal to connect pieces and prepare for potential central action. The black king now ventures toward the center, a bold step amidst the developing queenside pressure. Pushing the f-pawn aims to gain queenside space and potentially open lines, but watch out for king's safety if the center becomes too exposed. Pawn advances like this can unlock central pawns and create attacking chances, but they also weaken adjacent squares. Securing the b-file to potentially exploit white's pawn structure and prepare for future advances. Reorganizing knight to a more active square, aiming for central influence or a kingside attack later. Creating a powerful outpost on the 6th rank, this knight forces a positional dilemma for black's pieces. Repositioning the rook to support the advanced knight and prepare for potential pawn pushes offers good defensive possibilities. Centralizing the knight on b4 bolsters the queenside blockade and prepares potential raids. Asserting pressure on the queen side, black repositions the rook to engage white's pawns and create counterplay. Repositioning the rook to the 3rd rank prepares to contest the open b-file, eyeing potential infiltration. Mobilizing the bishop to support the queenside expansion and prepare for eventual central pawn breaks. Shifting the knight back reinforces the kingside defense and prepares for a potential kingside pawn push. Bringing the rook to the open file offers vital support for potential pawn breaks or defensive maneuvers. Seeking to activate the knight and create a dynamic central presence, white prepares to contest key squares. Reconnecting the bishop aims to fortify the kingside pawn structure. A subtle consolidation, preparing to finally activate the kingside pawns. Solidifying the pawn chain on the kingside offers a glimmer of counterplay amidst white's encroaching knights. Reactivating the king's role might be necessary for endgame considerations. Repositioning the rook to a more active file, aiming to challenge white's queenside control and potentially exploit the open file. Repositioning the bishop to a more active diagonal enhances white's control over the kingside. Repositioning the rook aims to harass white's queenside pawns, creating dynamic imbalances. Preparing the g-file for potential pressure as white seeks to activate his rook and challenge black's cramped position. Solidifying pawns and preparing for a defensive posture, this move begins to organize black's structure against the open c-file. Opening the g-file now unleashes attacking potential against black's uncastled monarch. Opening the g-file now creates dynamic opportunities and potential threats against the kingside. Opening the h-file now promises a sharp battle, potentially exposing black's king. Opening that g-file opens avenues for the rook to attack. Opening the g-file aggressively now unleashes a decisive attack against the uncastled black king. Exposing the white king via this forceful exchange unlocks attacking chances along the g-file. Reclaiming the open file and reinforcing the central pawn push offers a new avenue for attack. Initiating counterplay against white's king with piece repositioning. Opening the knight's path to the queen side opens tactical avenues for attack or repositioning. Repositioning to exploit the open file, this rook creates immediate pressure.